Hello, everyone. Welcome to Build Initiative's second webinar in a series on refugee experiences of relocation. My name is Danielle Fuentes Johnson. I'm a Special Projects Manager at Build Initiative. As we get started, please feel free to place your name and location in the chat box. This session is being recorded and will be shared along with the PowerPoint, resources, and contact information in the days following the webinar. As the war in Ukraine is currently entering its 6th month, its adverse effects on a nation of children become more deeply rooted. And we're reminded constantly that Ukrainian children, many of whom have been forced to flee with their families, are not the first to suffer this fate. In 2020, worldwide, close to half the refugees and asylum seekers forcibly displaced from their own countries were children. But upon arrival to this country, many refugees of color soon are faced with the additional burdens of inequitable, racist, and anti-Black immigration and refugee policies and national sentiment. And they quickly come to realize that this country may not provide the solutions to their problems. We're presenting this webinar series to not only highlight for early childhood systems the experiences of many refugee and asylee families and young children in the United States, and how racism continues to traumatize immigrants, refugees, and asylees long after their arrival, but to offer practical strategies from individuals who have experienced resettlement and those who are supporting refugee families and young children in equitable ways. Throughout the series, we'll meet early childhood professionals who have lived the refugee and asylee experience, as well as those who are working side by side to support these communities. And we'll present strategies that build on refugee and immigrant strength and resilience. Our hope is that you'll leave these sessions considering how you can use your influence and leadership to make a positive impact for refugee and asylee families and young children, regardless of their country of origin, religion, or color. We want to note that today we will be discussing a very heavy and emotional topic. This webinar recording and PowerPoint will be available in the days following the webinar. If you need to listen to it in pieces at another time, please feel free to do so. Let's take a look at our agenda for today. So today we're going to welcome all of you. We're going to take a second to set the stage, at which point I'll turn it over to our guest speaker, Dr. Monica Noriega, Assistant Professor of Child Trauma Research Center of San Francisco. And then she'll help us walk through the stages of immigration and resettlement trauma, share with us a case example, help us understand the concept of liberation-based entry points, and then we'll close out our time together with resources and our next steps. So as we begin, we want to take a moment on the next slide to review how BUILD includes refugee families and young children in our work and vision toward creating more just and equitable early childhood systems to ensure more promising futures for all young children placed furthest from opportunity. First is that refugee and asylee families and young children are an asset to their communities as they bring a variety of valuable lived experiences, knowledge, cultural and linguistic diversity, strength, and resilience. Second, that systemic racism, anti-Blackness, colorism, and anti-Muslim sentiment are often the basis for the myths and misconceptions that permeate public perception of refugees and continue to influence policy and national sentiment. Third, that strategies and system components supporting refugee families must be in place and coordinated to respond to their diverse needs and meet the needs of each and every child. On the next slide, we'll look at number 4 and 5. That to be effective and culturally responsive, strategies for working with refugee families and young children must be informed by, created in partnership with, and include them in key decision-making. And lastly, that strategies and system components for refugee families and young children must support retaining their home language and culture in order for these children to thrive. On the next slide, we're going to take a look at some of the terms we'll be using throughout the series. Refugees are individuals who are now outside of their country of origin because of feared persecution, conflict, violence, or other circumstances and require international protection. Some examples right now of large populations coming to the US as refugees include those from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burma, and Ukraine. Asylum seekers are those whose request for sanctuary has yet to be processed. And currently, the largest groups seeking asylum here are from China, Venezuela, and El Salvador. We'll be hearing some of their experiences in today's session. Internally displaced people are located from around the world, and unlike refugees, are on the run in their home country. Also of note, as we familiarize ourselves with these terms and definitions, that refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced people, even when they're from the same country, are not monolithic. They arrive in the camps and then in the United States from various socioeconomic, educational, religious, cultural, and linguistic backgrounds, and may have different experiences of immigration and resettlement. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Monica Noriega, who will share with us her presentation, Ghosts in the Borderland, Speaking the Unspeakable About Immigration Trauma at the US-Mexico Border. Monica, we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Danielle, for that kind introduction and for going over those terms with us. I think I will share my screen in just a second. Oh, there we go. Thanks, Jonathan. Jonathan is our beloved tech support today. So thank you so much, Jonathan, for being here and helping us make today a success. All right, does everyone see my slide? All right, great. So again, this presentation that I'm really pleased to share with you all is called The Ghosts in the Borderlands, Speaking the Unspeakable About Immigration Trauma at the US-Mexico Border. Just a few disclosures, and who am I? So my name is Monica Noriega, as Danielle mentioned. I'm coming to you from Oakland, California. I'm originally from Salinas, California, identify as Chicana. And just a few disclosures about what to expect in today's presentation. I think that this topic is incredibly important and is incredibly painful. And oftentimes when we as professionals or people that have dedicated our lives to working with children and families, and particularly children and families that have histories of being displaced or of immigration trauma, sometimes their stories get too far removed from the effective truths, the feeling, the pain that is the experience of displacement. Not all experiences of immigration are traumatic, but many of them are. So full disclosure, my goal today is to get us in our feelings a little bit about this topic, but with the intentional sort of purpose of mobilizing us to do more and allowing those feelings to travel through us and push us towards each other so we can make our communities, our places of work, and our world a better place, a more welcoming place, a healthier place for these families, because they are worth it. And I do have some political views that I may express in this presentation that are based in my own research, but they do not reflect any of the places where I work, or any of the places where you work, or the Build Foundation. So Danielle went over our agenda, but I'm just going to go over very quickly. I'm going to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about what is happening at the US-Mexico border, kind of bringing us all up to speed about the latest data of what has been going on at the US-Mexico border, particularly with immigration from the Latinx diaspora and the Afro-Caribbean diaspora. And then I'm going to introduce the early childhood lens and really talk about the stages of immigration trauma and why it's so important to keep those in mind when working with young children and families. And I'm going to share with you an example that's very near and dear to my heart of a family that I have worked with in my own clinical work as a clinical psychologist. And then we'll have some time to think about, what do we do with all this? Now that we've gone through this journey, what is our entry point? What role do I want to play in this work? And then I'll share some resources. So I want to start today's conversation with a quote by esteemed queer poet, Chicana, lyricist, almost prophet in a way, Gloria Anzaldúa. And she says that borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. And I start today with Gloria Anzaldúa because she was the one that coined the term borderlands. Maybe folks can put in the chat if you've read Borderlands before or any of Gloria Anzaldúa's work. But she coined the term borderlands, not to describe the physical space that exists in the borderlands, that is the area between the US and Mexico, the areas that were once Mexico, were once indigenous lands and that are now part of the United States. But she made this term to describe the identity conflict, the identity crisis that emerges for people that have had to cross borders or interact with borders throughout their lives or throughout their lineages, and creates this sense of displacement, the ni de aquí ni de allá, not from here, not from there. And what that does to our collective psyche, to our communities, when we are not allowed to be our fullest, most authentic selves. And here to the right, I have this photo that was taken at the US-Mexico border, on the border between Brownsville, Texas and Matamoros, Mexico, where one of the largest refugee camps used to be of asylum seekers, mostly from Latin America. And a little boy looking at the Rio Bravo, the Rio Grande, over towards what seems to be a detention center. And so now, just a very brief history. I don't take myself to be a historian in any way, but I do think it's important that we name that immigration in the United States has been criminalized over time. We know that, as I mentioned earlier, much of the Western United States at one time used to be Mexico. Then after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States made an agreement with Mexico saying that people that were already here, that were already on these lands, could retain those lands and could retain their way of life and were able to cross back and forth freely. As we know, over time, that treaty, as many treaties between the United States and indigenous people, were not upheld. And over time, the border became increasingly militarized. The story of my family in particular was one of the Braceros program, which was a World War II era program where they called them brazos, but like men, strong-armed men were recruited, many of them living in abject poverty, to come to the United States to work under the guise that it would be a guest worker program. They would be provided food, housing, medical care, and adequate pay. The reality of that program was that many of them were robbed of their wages, many of them lost their lives, many of them were treated like animals. They were called brazos, they were called arms, they were not seen as full humans. And many of them, and also shortly after the Bracero program, were either sent back to Mexico or many of them remained here in the United States. And I bring up that context because there has been a precedent over time in the United States where certain periods have been more hospitable to immigrants and others have not. We are living in an era where the climate is not only not hospitable to immigrants, but is violent to them, is vehemently attacking them. And we have seen an increase of military presence, of deaths, and of sort of increased severity of challenges because of this sort of legacy of immigration policies that have been increasingly inhospitable to different groups, but particularly groups from the Latinx diaspora. So in the past few months, just in this summer alone, and I show this graph so we can kind of take a look over time of how much immigration has increased, or how much, not necessarily immigration has increased, but how much this militarization of the border has impacted immigration by way of apprehensions and encounters at the border. An encounter means that someone interacted with CBP, which is Customs and Border Patrol. In the month of June alone, there were over 207,000 encounters with CBP in June. And many of those encounters were actually with only over 153,000 individual people, which means that a lot of people are being apprehended and then sent back. And then they try again, and then they get sent back. We can see over time since the Trump administration and now going into the Biden administration, we're seeing an overall stark increase in single adults and trying to enter the US, families, family units, and unaccompanied children. And over 44 of those encounters, those over 207,000 encounters that I mentioned earlier, have ended in expulsion, which means that they were apprehended and then expelled. Does not mean necessarily you were sent back to your country, but that you were dumped somewhere on the other side of the border. And a lot of those expulsions have to do with Trump era policies, including the zero tolerance policy, which led to the separation of children from their families, Title 42, which is an archaic immigration policy dating back to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which allowed the United States to deter immigration under the guise of public health. So what Title 42 says is that we can stop someone from coming to this country, stop people from coming if we believe that they are diseased or they could threaten the public health of the country. So under that policy, there has been an increase in expulsions, and this has also had a huge impact on people fleeing violence from their home countries. Just gonna check the chat, make sure there's no questions. All right. So the violence of Title 42 and the migrant protection protocols. So on the tail of Title 42, during the Trump administration, there was the emergence of what was called the migrant protection protocols, aka the Remain in Mexico policy. These policies did not allow people seeking asylum or are fleeing violence in their countries to plead asylum, which is an international human right, at ports of entry. But instead, we're told that you have to wait in Mexico or in certain areas that are some of the most dangerous areas on the US-Mexico border until they are given a chance to cross and plead their case. The Remain in Mexico policy has been going on since 2019. Just this August, the Supreme Court and the Biden administration finally certified that Remain in Mexico, aka MPP, will be ending, which is excellent news. But in the past, this has gone back and forth, and many courts have tied up this process. The problem with Remain in Mexico is that people, including children, families that are already fleeing violence, are having to wait for months, sometimes years at a time, in camps that are extremely dangerous, in places where they're exposed to extreme cold, extreme heat, to hunger, to cartel violence. And many folks that have to present themselves at the border are then detained and then sent back to some of the most dangerous areas in the dead of night. Just this week, some articles have published that CBP has expelled children and families sometimes as young as 3 and under, at midnight or later. Over 30,000 children are being dumped on the other side of the border in the dead of night in some of the most dangerous areas. And many of them have been kidnapped. Many of them have been killed. So the stakes are really, really high. And so let's think together about what is the message that these immigration policies send to asylum seekers. So we know that these policies exist. They were put in place by certain administrations, and they have operated in a way that has perpetuated certain messages that collude with racist ideologies. We know that under Title 42 and under MPP, only 1% of Ukrainian asylum seekers have been expelled or have been denied entry, but 33% at least of all Haitian asylum seekers were expelled under Title 42. This graph here on the left also shows data for other countries. Up to 61% of Guatemalan asylum seekers were expelled under Title 42, 52% of Honduran asylum seekers, up to 89% of Mexican asylum seekers who also seek asylum, fleeing from mostly cartel violence and other forms of violence that is happening in Mexico. So taking a step back, when we pause and think about, these aren't just numbers, these are people, these are their lives, these are families, these are children. What is the message that sends? Why is my family's safety less valuable than this family's safety? How are these decisions made? And what are the consequences of them? These policies, in short, cause death. Border deaths increase at a rate that is extremely alarming as these policies harden, as these policies are allowed to go on for extended periods of time in their effort to deter migrants. We all heard about, I hope, a few months ago when in San Antonio, Texas, over 40 migrants, including asylum seekers, were found dead in this truck, abandoned in the desert. These policies don't deter families from coming. They just push them into more dangerous situations. In 2022 alone is already one of the worst years on record for deaths of migrants on the US side of the US-Mexico border. CBP found over 600 remains of migrants thus far this year. And as you can see in this graph, that's almost double, triple of the number of remains that they found in 2020. And 151 of those deaths were CBP related. So that means that those people died in detention or in their custody. And so what's going on with parent-child separations? The zero tolerance policy that was enacted by Trump in 2018 has since ended, and yet the consequences of it are still alive and well and have yet to be resolved. The Biden administration has brought together 400 of those families, luckily that were separated under the zero tolerance policy, but the parents of 168 of those children have yet to be located. People come and face these situations for a variety of valid reasons, because of poverty, inequality, environmental racism, the climate catastrophe, state terror, community violence, violence against women is a huge one, and just overall widespread imperialism and corruption. And a lot of people also just come seeking a better life, and that is also a valid reason. And so now on the topic of immigration detention, as we think about those 160 people that have died or have suffered in immigration detention and have suffered fatalities there, we think about how has this system come to be? At what point did our country allow a system to become so big, so powerful, that we have thousands of people, including children, including families, people fleeing violence, that are locked in cages for months at a time? This book that I recommend to you all, The Carceral Shadows and Tangled Technologies of Immigration Detention, says that the roots of immigration detention are like tentacles that reach into the southern soil of US slavery, where the heritage of slave labor, the control of free Blacks, and the recapture of fugitive slaves provided a societal blueprint and legal precedent for immigration detention and deportation. You can see the photo on the right here, one of the earliest photos of immigration detention, where thousands of families were put in literal cages, as you see here, with chain link fences for long periods of time. This area is what is known as the perrera, aka the dog cage, where folks are first sort of sent to as they're being processed. The photo here on the left, sort of a similar situation. Guess where that photo is from? The bracero, from Operation Wetback. Operation Wetback was a real law, a real policy that existed in 1954 that was used to round up anyone that they believed might have been Mexican, might have been Latino, many of whom were US citizens, and sent to Mexico, sent to areas that many of them had never been to in their lives. And this photo here at the bottom, I'm sure as many of you have seen also, is a frightening photo of a Border Patrol officer holding a whip and threatening Haitian asylum seekers and Afro-Caribbean asylum seekers attempting to cross. Seeking asylum is a human right. It is not a crime to seek asylum. And yet, as we know, the trauma of immigration does not begin or end at apprehensions at the border, does not begin or end with immigration policies that the United States puts forth, but has roots that extend way deeper than that. When we are working with families, when we think about a family story, perhaps after they have crossed or after they have been released from immigration detention, it's really important that we go back to the beginning. Let's think about the pre-migration stage. What happened before they left? What caused them to flee? What was life like before? What did they love about the place where they were from? And also, the story of immigration trauma is a story of separations. What were the pre-separation experiences of that child, of that family? How secure were their attachments back in their home country? How much violence or chaos or challenges were they exposed to in their home country? And most importantly, what was the developmental stage of that child or that person when they had to flee? Because that's going to have a big impact on how they might adjust to this process and their capacity to process. Then we want to think about the in-transit stage. We know the journey to the United States, particularly from areas in Central America or what is known as the Northern Triangle, which is Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, is one of the most dangerous journeys that anyone can ever sort of face. Many women report taking different types of contraception. So that way, if they get sexually assaulted, that sexual assault will not result in a pregnancy. Many people will report being extorted, being kidnapped, and overall suffering really horrific conditions, particularly those that fall under the Migrant Protection Protocols or Title 42. And then we have the asylum-seeking or temporary resettlement stage. And under this stage sort of falls the category of being placed in immigration detention and being shuffled around between different detention centers. And then after you're released, maybe not knowing where you're going to live and living in multiple places for a few years. And this is also the sort of phases where we want to think about the circumstances of the separations that happen for this family. Maybe if they were not separated at the border or they did not suffer sort of any additional traumas during their journey, we want to think about that this is a stage where they're going to be mourning the separations that occurred prior to leaving their country of origin. And then we have the post-migration ongoing traumatization stage. And this stage is sort of divided into three parts because it is ongoing. It occurs across the lifespan. There's a period of overcompensation, particularly when a person first arrives. And then there's a period of decompensation because our nervous systems cannot physically sustain a fight or flight response for a sort of extended period of time. And then we have the transgenerational conflict stage, particularly for families that might be reunited after long periods of time, reunited with other family members, trying to integrate into a new community. And then we think about the post-separation placement / reunification. What is it like for this family to come together again after everything that they have been through? Going back to what I said earlier about the pre-migration stage and the importance of paying attention to the developmental stage of a particular child when they are forced to flee their country of origin, is because each developmental stage is connected to a concrete fear. Some of these normative developmental anxieties that are normative for that developmental stage. These are fears that everyone feels, everyone has to confront at some point in their lives, and often more than once. But the way that those fears are coped with, the way that that fear is addressed during these sensitive periods of development sets a blueprint in a way to how we might be able to metabolize or make sense of other times in our lives when that fear comes true. The fear of separation is a fear I think even a lot of adults have of being afraid of being separated from someone you love. But for a child between 8 to 24 months, that fear is particularly salient because that is the period where they are learning how to move their bodies, where they are learning the separation between me and mom or me and dad. And then wonderings start to begin about separation anxiety. And if you leave, are you coming back? And how terrifying it is for a child when you go into the other room and they really don't know if you're coming back. And then we have the fear of losing love, which is particularly salient during the 18 to 36 month range. Because during this developmental period, children are developing theory of mind. They are learning that mom and dad and brother and sister have thoughts and feelings and interests that have nothing to do with me. That sounds terrible. I thought it was all about me. And it's totally normative. It makes so much sense that children have that capacity early in life to feel so connected to, so much in synchronicity with their caregivers because they depend on them for their literal survival. But during that 18 to 36 month range, the reality sets in that people's thoughts and wishes and urges might be different than my own. And that can cause terror. And if I do something bad, are you going to stop loving me? And what does that mean if I no longer have your love or approval? And that leads us to the fear of bodily damage, 12 to 36 months. When I develop awareness of other people's intentions, I also develop awareness of my own body and that I can hurt my body. And you start to have a little more caution around how you move, particularly around these stages when we start to locomote. Our children start to sort of engage in more risky behaviors, and they don't have the sort of the risk assessment skills yet to be able to control their impulses. And finally, the most sort of salient fear I want us to keep in mind for this morning's talk is the fear of being bad. The fear of that if I do something wrong, or if someone tells me that I was a bad girl, I was a bad boy, does that mean that I'm inherently bad? Is there something bad inside me? If I do something wrong, can I make up for it? Is it just a mistake? Or does it say something about who I am as a person? This also coincides with the development of theory of mind, a child's ability to take into account not only that mom, dad, brother, sister have different wishes and desires and interests, but the world expects things of me. Society has rules and expectations that I need to follow. Like red means stop and green means go. But what happens if I feel like I broke one of those rules and I was bad? So it's really important that grown-ups and communities take the time to make sense of these fears for children during these sensitive periods and throughout the lifespan. And I say this in relation to immigration trauma and our topic this morning for families fleeing violence, particularly from the Latinx diaspora, because I want us to hold in mind the question of what happens to a child, to a family, to a people when society confirms your deepest fears and justifies them. Losing a loving and protective parent is one of the biggest single tragedies that can happen to a child. And so what happens to a people when society confirms that you can lose your loving, protective parent, we can separate them from you, and nothing will be done about it? Those forced separations, although thank goodness they are no longer sort of written in the law of the land, and the zero tolerance policy has then ended, many children continue to be separated from their parents under Title 42 and under MPP because families fear that if they have to sort of wait too long in these conditions, in these asylum or refugee camps in Matamoros, in Reynosa, and in Tijuana, and other places on the US-Mexico border with really high violence rates, that something terrible might happen to their child. And maybe they would be safer if they send them across. So we should think about together, what is the impact of these immigration-related family separations, not only at the border, but also before. A lot of children get sent over with a family member or have one parent still in the home country. And these forced separations that are not happening by choice, shatter the developmental expectation of protection of the attachment figure. Remember what I said earlier about children need their parents to keep them safe? Biologically, we have that urge to connect because we can't survive without our parents. These types of separations shatter that expectation. Caregivers and children might also serve as traumatic reminders for one another when they are sort of reunited. We know that children that have these histories of immigration-related separations have an increased risk for internalizing symptoms. So that means that their feelings go inside. They might be more withdrawn, more sad, more sort of disconnected with reality. And we also see children on the other end of the spectrum that might have more acting out behaviors. But overall, in my work, I've seen more social isolation, difficulty naming and processing feelings later on in life, and sometimes attachment disorders, difficulty attaching to anyone, developing safe relationships with anyone. And these things don't just affect the child's core beliefs, the family's core beliefs, but are also linked to how the community thinks and feels and responds to these fears. what are the mitigating factors? What are the things that we can hold in mind as people that care about children and families? Well, some things that we can ask about or we can hold in mind is the controllability and the desirability of the separation. Was this something that they were able to plan for and say, okay, in a couple months, you're going to go with Papi and you're going to go across and you're going to go live with Tio? How was the quality of the relationship prior to the separation? Was there already such a strong relationship and they didn't have sort of a long trauma history beforehand? What was the age and developmental level of the child? Let's think about those sensitive periods of development and hope that these separations didn't happen during one of those. How much was the family able to prepare for and anticipate the separation? How long and chronic is a separation? So are they able to anticipate how long it's going to be before the family can be together again? And what was their ability to maintain phone contact or visitations? Luckily, with the technology we have nowadays and WhatsApp and all the other beautiful technologies, families are able to remain in contact more than before. But maybe the lack of visitations, the lack of ability to just fly home for a couple days, for a week, might also come into play and make it hard to live with a family that's separated by immigration at any stage. And for all these reasons and many more, it's so important that we reclaim this narrative, that we support families in reclaiming this narrative for themselves. Because when children are not given a narrative, are not given the words to understand their experience and their feelings, they make up their own explanations to make sense of the violence they experienced, to resolve that conflict they feel inside. On the right, there's this article that was published by NPR last year, and it says that US border agents found a toddler and a baby abandoned along the Rio Grande. But if you look a little closer at this photo, and feel free to lean in, this is a webinar, no one can see you looking really close at your screen. That little girl's braids are perfectly coiffed. Her clothes are clean. She has a little bag next to her. Her shoes are clean. The little baby's in the shade. Their feet are clean. They have a blanket. Those don't look like abandoned children to me. Those look like children possibly that were placed in a difficult situation and that probably had people that loved them that were placed in an even more difficult situation. And so putting all these things together, children and families that cross multiple international borders to come to a place where they believe they will be safer, where they believe their children will have a better life, are acutely aware of the risks of family separation, are acutely aware that they will likely be apprehended and detained. Many of them plan for that. A lot of particularly women and mothers are acutely aware of the risk of violence against women, against their bodies along their journey. They are aware that the rates of femicide or the killing of women because they are women is extraordinarily high in places like Mexico. That the risk of being raped or sexually assaulted is also incredibly high. And also, if they are detained in certain states, a lot of women are also aware that they might be forcibly sterilized if they go for if they have to sort of go through a medical procedure while they're in detention. But what trauma does is it fragments, it disconnects us from the reality that we're seeing to our internal world and to many other sort of resources that we may otherwise have access to help us overcome these stressors. But what often providers and people working with these families, us too, we might be focused on these really scary, horrific things, but we might lose sight of the fact that these things are also exacerbating and amplifying this fear of separation, the fear of bodily harm, the fear of losing love, and the fear of being bad. A lot of these immigration policies, particularly ones like Title 42, that say you can't come in because you're diseased, or policies like zero tolerance, that we're going to prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law if you break the law by entering this country at a legal port of entry seeking asylum, is saying that you are bad, you are criminal. This is happening to you because you put yourself in this situation. And on a biological level, on the level of our genes and the ways that our brain forms in response to complex chronic traumas over time, is it literally changes our reticular activating system, the parts of our brain that determine how we process emotions, how sensitive we are to the emotions of others, and a slew of other things. But what often gets left out of this narrative as well is not only what's happening inside these circles, inside these multiple layers of experiencing of life, are these external factors. Not external factors, but these overwhelming sort of entities that permeate every sense of our sense of self and sense of community. What about the culture of white supremacy, of ongoing colonization, the legacies of sort of cis heteropatriarchy that condones and has contributed to violence against women over time, and of racial capitalism that has made it difficult for certain families, particularly Black, Brown, and Indigenous families, to sustain their livelihoods over time, particularly in parts of Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean diaspora. And this is also not just the story, as we know, of individual families or individual peoples, but of intergenerational legacies of displacement and survival amidst all of these sources of oppression. And so in this next segment, I want to give you all a warning that I'm going to play a clip. Remember what I said earlier about the importance of us feeling this content in our bones. If you don't have the bandwidth for it today, I can invite you to take a step out for 2 minutes and then come back. But I'm going to play a clip of a recording of a child that was in immigration detention and was separated from their parents. And even if you don't speak Spanish, you don't have to speak the language to be able to feel and hear these core fears being activated in that child at that particular moment. And I want to invite you all to let this moment radicalize you, let it mobilize you, let it move you, rather than lead you to despair.
Bueno, aquí tenemos una orquesta. ¿De dónde son ustedes? ¿Y tú?
Guatemala.
No llores. Vas a llegar con... Mira, ella te va a explicar y te va a ayudar. ¿Cierto, Consuelo?
¿Qué va a pasar con su consulado hoy? Papá. Papá. Con mi tía por lo menos para que después llegue mi mami. Quiero que se paren mi papá. No quiero que lo deporte. El papá. Papá. Voy a llamar a mi tía para que después de comer me venga a recoger. Tengo el número yo de memoria, 34. Ay, no puedo. Y después para que llegue mi mami lo más pronto posible. No, primero con papá. Primero con papá. Primero con papá. Solo lo voy a ver si lo está.
Just take a minute. Take a deep breath in. Let it out. One more time, breathe in. And breathe out. 2 more times like that. Breathe in. Breathe out. And breathe in. Breathe out. Thank you all. Thank you for going there with me. Just notice the sensations in your body, the lump in your throat, the tears in the back of your eyes, the tension in your shoulders, maybe the knots in your stomach. What is the message that those sensations are telling you? What is the fear? What is the pain that those voices left you with, reminded you of? What we just heard were not just the cries of those children, but were the cries of an entire people that have been told repeatedly that you are bad, you will be separated, your body will be harmed, and you will not be loved or treated with kindness. And the definition of trauma is quite simple. It's when something happens, or several things happen, that overwhelm the resources that you and your people have available to overcome that thing. The sense of overwhelm that we might all feel in our bodies right now can't be sustained here or here for a very long time. After a while, if we are still in that sense of overwhelm, those feelings have to go underground. They have to go somewhere else. And once they go underground, sometimes they leak out at other times in our lives, and particularly in our relationships. Selma Freiberg coined the term ghosts in the nursery to teach us about the importance it is for adults, and particularly for parents, to connect with the feelings that have gone underground from their childhoods, the screams, the cries that went unheard or unprocessed from their childhoods. Ghosts in the Borderlands refers to the feelings, the cries, the sense of overwhelm that has gone underground for an entire people. The Ghosts in the Borderlands refers to the mechanisms that allow an entire people to withstand the overwhelming fears of being bad and being separated and being harmed over time. And so when we are working with a family, when we are thinking about what to do, how can I be of support, let's remember that how we are is more important than what we do. How connected we are to these feelings, to this reality, is just as important as what we do. And now, to continue this kind of trend that we're on of making this topic real and really connecting with it in our bones, I want to tell you all the story of Elena and Luis. Elena and Luis were a parent-child dyad, a mother and a son, that I worked with for over 2 years, and they were from Honduras. They were a family that had a long legacy of pre-migration traumatic experiences. Elena, when she was just 6 years old, witnessed domestic violence in her home that led to her mother and her father fleeing Honduras. Her mom fleeing the violence that she experienced because she was unable to get the help that she needed in her home country, was unable to get the protection she needed, came to the US and promised to send for her. And then later, her dad was sort of extorted and attacked by organized crime groups there. And then he also fled to the United States, sort of separately. And she was left under the care of her grandmother. And over the course of her life, the situation in Honduras got worse and worse. I'm sure many of you know that there have been coups, some of which the US has supported, and serious economic and political strife in Honduras. All that has had a really sort of big impact on how young women and girls sort of are able to survive, particularly in poor rural communities like where Elena was from. When Elena was 16 years old, she was sexually assaulted by a man in the community, and that sexual assault resulted in a pregnancy. Where Elena is from, it's not easy to get access to reproductive health. She was not able to access an abortion, and unfortunately had to carry her pregnancy to term. Shortly after Luis, her son, was born, Elena then had to make the very difficult decision to flee Honduras because she was also found herself in another sort of domestic violence situation with another man in her community, and then made the difficult decision to flee that situation to be reunited with her mother here in the United States. Elena and Luis's journey to the United States. Luis was only 3 years old when they came together, and Elena was only 19 at the time. During their journey, they came partially on bus, partially on foot. Elena spent several weeks in different camp situations, sleeping outside, oftentimes not having enough to eat. Whatever she had or could get a hold of, she would give to Luis. She also luckily was not sexually assaulted, but she did witness cartel violence and sort of different forms of gun violence during their journey, and was overall sort of terrified that something would happen to her, or that the smuggler that was taking them to the border would take advantage of her like other men had in her past. And when Elena and Luis arrived at the border, they were detained for over 2 days in what was called the hielera, which is a Spanish word for that means icebox in English, but is a windowless cold room, kind of similar to the picture I showed earlier. And they waited and they waited. They were not given adequate food or warm clothing. And one by one, they would hear different mothers and families and their children being called. And then only the mother would come back and not the child. After that happened 2 or 3 times, Elena figured out that they were taking the children, and she didn't know where they were taking them. And after several hours, her and Luis's name was called, and Luis was taken from her. After over 2 days of being separated, Elena would ask, "Where's my son? Where, how can I get back with him?" They would not answer her. They would ignore her. Finally, when they were reunited, she described it as they kind of just released all the children to run back to their mothers. And she said that all the other children ran to their mothers crying, relieved to see their parents, and Luis wouldn't even look at her. He was just standing there. And Elena was destroyed. What did I do to my child? Why won't he look at me? Just racked with guilt, inappropriate guilt, that she may have caused this. And finally, when they were able to be released from immigration detention and relocated to be reunited with her mother, there was also that period of overcompensation, decompensation, and transgenerational conflict. It was no walk in the park to be reunited with their mother after 10 years apart. They had some conflict between them, and Luis had several developmental delays that required early intervention, and it was really challenging for her to navigate the system at first. And after some time, she was able to get him, and with the help of her primary care provider and several regional centers, they were able to get them the services they need. They were able to access mental health care, and I can say happily that they are doing much, much better now, but it was a very long and hard journey to get there. And in their journey and getting connected to these services, and also getting reconnected with each other, of all the interventions that we did together, of all of the services that we did, the golden thread between what I did as their clinical psychologist, what the special education teacher did at their school, what the social worker did, what the lawyer did, was a common thread of supporting this family and being able to sit with and name and feel all of the feelings that have gone underground, all of the feelings that went underground, not only during their journey, during the separation, but also prior to that. And so putting all these things together, and not to oversimplify this work at all, because the story of Elena and Luis by no means has ended, and by no means has the work sort of been completed in a sort of a neat fashion. But if at any point we have the opportunity to allow families to name and connect with those core fears that are activated at every stage of the immigration trauma process, might give us the opportunity to help them allow those feelings that have once been underground to be released and metabolized. The ghost in the borderlands concept can also help us understand how those feelings can also be manifested across communities at a cultural, communal, collective level. And as much as possible, that we can pass the mic and create collective stories, collective narratives of everybody's stories and the ways that we are all impacted by these policies and these realities might help us tap into our collective power so we can put an end to these atrocities. And so now I want to ask you, what role do you play in this struggle for healing and justice for asylum seekers impacted by migration trauma? Unfortunately, I ran up on time and I'm not going to have time to go into this in detail, but you will have these slides and you might be able to read some of these questions. And I encourage you to go and sit somewhere, maybe with a group of people, and ask yourselves these questions to really think about which of these liberation-based entry points. And I say liberation-based as opposed to healing-based, as opposed to sort of wellness-based, because the point here is not just to heal and move on, but to create a new way of life, a new system that allows people to be their freest, most authentic selves, a new system that allows us to keep families together. And so I don't think we'll have time to use a poll, but maybe folks want to put in the chat, which of these entry points do you feel most called to right now? Is it just the individual level, going internally, reflecting on your own? Is it the mutual aid level, donating to a cause, seeing how you can support other local orgs? Is it the institutional level, getting more active in your own agency and institutions that you are part of to take a stand to sort of put an end to these atrocities? Or is it the policy level? Do you have a seat at the table? Are you able to access these circles of policies that are being made? How can we get more involved in this process? Feel free to think to yourself. It's okay if you don't sort of feel pulled to maybe one right now. But I encourage you all to take the time to ask yourselves these questions and think about which of these entry points can I commit to today? And finally, I want us to take everything that we've heard here today as a call to action. And action can look a lot of ways. If you want to learn more about what are the conditions, what are the histories that have caused this sort of crisis that has led to so many people fleeing their countries in the Northern Triangle, I encourage you to read The Open Veins of Latin America. It's a really amazing book. And here's a list of organizations that are doing a really amazing work to support families in getting here safely and to keep families together, including Haitian Bridge, Kino Border Collective, the Sidewalk School for Children of Asylum Seekers, Bay Area Border Relief, Raices, and many more. And I'll end with just a final quote, starting and ending with Gloria Anzaldúa. And Anzaldúa says that to survive in the borderlands, you must live sin fronteras, without borders. Be a crossroads. And with that, I leave you all, and I will turn it back over to Danielle. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for going with us on this painful and difficult journey. It's the journey we know that many of our families and children that we work with have undertaken. And I encourage you all to take a moment following the presentation to sit for a moment and gather yourself and breathe as Monica led us in that exercise. Thank you, Monica, for taking us there and taking us there in a way that leaves us in a good place and some good questions to think about. What can we do and where is our impact? So with that, we want to thank you again and invite you to join us next month on September 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern, when we will have a session where we hear from early childhood care and education programs, which are supporting refugee and asylee families and young children. And they'll share with us some practical strategies for supporting these children, as well as some system and policy recommendations. So again, we invite you to join us. We hope you won't want to miss it. As we close out our session today, Again, we're going to ask that you take a moment to provide your thoughts on the session in a survey, which will pop up as we close the meeting. These surveys and your feedback really help us deliver a product that better meets your needs. So we thank you in advance. And once again, gracias, Monica. And we will have the PowerPoint recording and resources available in the coming days. Thank you all so, so much, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Take good care.